by switching to a private tree trimming service, a private park maintenance service, and these businesses are burgeoning, especially in California, but also in other parts of the country. Now, another way around the problem of how to maintain and pay for a facility that you can't readily fence off is to look at who really benefits from that type of area. The example I like to give in this case comes to me from Dick Bjornseth in Houston, who's sitting in the back of the room, of the Houston Anti-Litter Team. It turns out that in Houston, nobody was maintaining the landscaping of freeway interchanges. And they were getting full of weeds and garbage and everything, and really an eyesore. And so a local developer decided this was just ridiculous. He couldn't get anywhere, complaining to all the different bureaucracies involved. So he got together all the local businesses surrounding the particular freeway interchange where his office was, convinced 63 out of 65 to sign up to hire a private firm to come in and clean it up and maintain it every month. And it got such nice press coverage that before he knew what was happening, he had an organization formed with other groups of business people coming to him for advice on how to do it, for consulting on how to get people organized and get these things set up. And they have an executive director. It's called the Houston Anti-Litter Team, and it is now beautifying freeways all around the Houston freeway system. Now, it occurs to me that if something as mundane and commonplace as a freeway interchange can be maintained voluntarily and privately because the particular people who are nearest to it find it of value to have it maintained in a good condition, how much more so would the people who live or have businesses surrounding and nearby a city park that's a spot of beauty and a change from the concrete of the city, be willing, if the alternative was not having it or having it be a garbage heap, be willing to get together and hire a firm and pay every month $20 or $30 or whatever it takes to do it, to maintain those parks? And the answer is, I think it's pretty obvious that in most cases they would. And so once again, we've identified there really are some people who benefit much more than others from particular public facilities, and it's not really a public good that economists say where everybody benefits. Everybody does in a very small way from having parks in the city, but there are some people that benefit, like an animal farm. Some are more equal than others. Some really do benefit a lot more than others, and they're the ones who really have the biggest incentive and interest in paying if the chips are down. Transit is something that's also obviously a private good, but that we've gotten accustomed to thinking of that we have to have a big public transit system. And here, again, it's important. Few people realize that there are profitable forms of mass transportation, but they are not large-scale bus systems that try to do everything. I think the development of suburbs in a large-scale way following World War II has changed the economics of mass transit to the point where these large fixed-route systems that try to serve a huge area are just economically infeasible. And that's why the private firms went out of business and why governments have gotten into the act to create these huge subsidized monsters that only pay for about 20 or 25% of their costs out of charges to the users. When you look at, you have to analyze transit problems, and there are two different components. One is high-density commuter runs, and those are profitable types of ventures. And right here in Southern California, there are many, many firms in the business of providing express bus service, usually on a subscription basis, to groups of employees in a single firm or groups of people who live and work in a particular area of downtowns. Those sorts of things, they typically charge about 3 times as much as the typical city transit system fare, but they make money. They provide a very good service that a lot of people demand, especially as gas prices get higher and higher. And so that kind of service is a normal private thing. Some of the companies are companies like Combus in Huntington Beach, right nearby here, commuter bus lines in Long Beach. These are large, thriving enterprises. The other component is and those are large, high-density, fixed-route services. The second type of transit is really the random origin destination for small numbers of people. And that is not best served by a large bus system. That's best served by things like jitneys, which are flexible, small, very low overhead operations. Anybody who owns a car can be a jitney operator. And in fact, where jitney services exist, and they're usually illegal, they're almost always illegal, and the few that exist are in places where the laws aren't enforced. They're very often low-income and minority people who are figuring out a way to make some money, working flexible hours, using a car that they just happen to have, and providing a really valuable service, often at no more or little more than bus fare. It's a very viable, free enterprise type of decentralized industry. And it can meet a huge need for transit services that is not being met very well at all by bus systems. And even just a simple development of legalizing shared riding in taxi cabs, where people can combine trips so that they're spreading the cost over more people, can work wonders. In Davenport, Iowa, for example, a company called the Royal Cab Company was allowed to have shared riding. And in the space of about 5 years, their ridership increased by 179%, and they started carrying more people than the local bus system. The local bus system didn't like that, but nonetheless, it stayed legal. And the average fare was $1.05, because shared riding made it economical to carry people at low fares. This kind of thing can happen. It can provide a huge expansion of flexible services that bus systems can't even match. Okay, we have 15 minutes left, and let me very briefly say a few words about welfare in hospitals and about public works, and then try to have a few questions. Welfare I don't really want to get into, except to say that the little bit that local officials can do to save money is not trivial. There's a lot of flexibility in interpreting the rules on eligibility and so forth, and fraud in welfare programs, even though most of the money comes from the federal government. And for example, the rate of fraud and error in Washington, D.C. is 35%, and in Los Angeles it's 3%. Now that tells you something about who has an incentive to run a tight ship, and where people don't have much incentive to check up that only those who are eligible get it, and that they only get it for as long as they are eligible by checking up frequently on whether they're still eligible. It makes a huge difference in what the overall amount of money that has to be dished out is, and in the number of people that you need to administer it and so forth. That's about all I want to say on it for right now. For city hospitals, here's another case of a so-called public good that's really just a private good being priced below market and operated inefficiently as a local socialized business. And there's a big trend going on all across the country in the last 10 years for private profit-making hospital chains to be growing and expanding, and either contracting with local public hospitals to take over management and cut costs by 10 or 15%, or in many cases to actually buy up a money-losing, old-fashioned public hospital, put in a lot of modern business-like methods, and operate it at a profit as a much better and more viable facility than it was before. Some of the firms involved, the Hospital Corporation of America, Humana Incorporated, Hospital Affiliates, and American Medical Care International. These are four of the biggest firms. And these chains are growing like 15-20% a year. It's really a thriving industry, and there are very significant cost savings involved, and it relieves a huge burden on the taxpayer to have a private firm take over and get this albatross off of the taxpayers' backs. Finally, public works. That concerns things like water and sewer systems, roads, bridges, harbors, airports, and so forth. Now, except for roads, which are difficult but not impossible to charge for, all these other things generate revenues already, and there's no reason whatever why they should be a drain on taxpayers. They should be paid for entirely out of fees charged to the users in proportion to their use, and financed by the capital expenditures financed by revenue bonds if they're public agencies, but they could very easily be privatized and made private bond and user charge financed entities, operating companies. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is nominally a public entity, but it operates entirely by user charges, tolls, and so forth, and is very close thing to a private company. And any airport or harbor can be a self-supporting, profit-making enterprise, and should be. And this is a very easy thing to advocate, privatizing these efforts. In 1978, the city of Garden Grove came very close to selling its water system to a private company, to private investors. They looked seriously at that as a means of coping with the revenue crunch from Proposition 13. It turned out, because the numbers didn't work out quite the way they wanted them to, that they didn't do it. But it's a live, viable option that a number of consultants have been recommending in the last couple of years as a means of easing the burden on taxpayers. Just privatize these services, the company that acquired it would issue bonds based on the future revenues to be derived from these very valuable facilities, and then would bring in professional management to operate them in a more business-like way and make money at them. It's really not that difficult. Well, I have loads and loads more examples and things, but I'd rather spend a few minutes answering questions from those of you who have them while we have time. Yes, here.
You mentioned jitneys are illegals just about everywhere. What is the argument for making them illegal, and how would we enforce them?
Okay, the argument is usually made by the taxi industry that has paid money to have a license to operate cabs. They'll make arguments that, oh, well, people will be robbed and murdered and this sort of thing if we just let anybody operate a cab, and we've got to have an extensive regulatory mechanism. And they'll also say that there's not enough business to support more than the existing number of cab companies, which is a total lie. What happens in cities where there's tight regulation of the number of cabs, which is true in most big cities, that cab service tends to concentrate at the high density areas like airports and hotels and the downtown business district, and all kinds of need for cab service that exist in other cities where there are more cabs just don't get met. In cities with large numbers of cabs like the Washington, D.C. area, people use cabs for all kinds of trips, from house to store and so forth. Old people use cabs, students use cabs, uses that don't even exist in places like Los Angeles, which have very few cabs. The market is there, but it's a lot easier for the firms that have a legally restricted market and are benefiting nicely from it to make all kinds of persuasive-sounding arguments that, oh, well, it'll be dog-eat-dog competition. Everyone will lose money because there'll be too many people trying for a limited number of customers. It's just not true. Completely phony argument. Yes, Stick in the back.
On the topic of private streets, helping reduce points of use.
Yes.
About 30% of the subdivisions in Houston now are platted with private streets, where the streets are owned privately and maintained privately. That ratio is fluxes or flexible recently. The second item is that on the west end of town, there's a newly developed area that they're building a private freeway, 10 miles long, strictly with private funds from some of the major developers in the area, because they don't want to wait for 5 or 10 years for the public to come along and build roads. And they're recovering their costs because of the appreciated land values of the adjoining property.
In other words, the land developers own the land and they're going to capture, okay. So have they gotten together and formed like an association to do this, to capture the increased land values?
It's called West Houston Association, and they're building this 10-mile stretch of highway.
Dick, may I ask you to write that up for Trends and Reason, please? Thank you. Yes, here.
There's a reaction against that, the private street concept, at least in Santa Rosa, where I reside. We had a development that we encouraged the private street concept, and then they came back and wanted to put a gate over to block off the traffic. And then the reaction from the other citizens in the city was, well, those people can drive on our streets, why the hell can't we drive on their streets? And it throws the whole thing into what of a positions, because you've got existing public streets and then you're giving privileges as some people view it to the folks.
That illustrates, there's a need for educating people as to what these things are about. And the fact is that if people are uniquely paying for their own private streets, then they certainly, he who pays the price should have some say in what goes on with the thing. And that message needs to be gotten out widespread and legitimized to counteract that kind of argument. There's a question here. Yeah.
Yeah, two questions. You mentioned the thousands of figures in the example. Are these compiled somewhere? Are they available somewhere?
Glad you asked that question. Well, I have my old booklet here, which are still available for $2, which is sort of what I knew as of 1976. But besides that, I have a book coming out. They say the end of March, but it'll probably really be sometime in April, called Cutting Back City Hall. It's a hardcover book, $12.50 from Universe Books in New York. It will be advertised in Reason. It will be available from Laissez-Faire Books and all sorts of other places, which has everything I've talked about today and 100 times more, chapters on every type of public service, theoretical framework in terms of private contracting and user charges, the theoretical advantages, the practical advantages. It has appendices. Well, here are some of the manuscript pages. The type has already been said. It's just about coming out. It has appendices listing private contractors across the country, research organizations that are sources of research materials on this, and so forth. So it should be an extremely valuable tool for any of you. And your other question?
Yeah. The question is, if you want to start somewhere in the city, say given that every city, 50 to 100,000 people, I think maybe 200,000, where should you start first? You want to make a good example. You want your first one to shine.
Right. Well, if I would say if the garbage collection is not already private, that's probably the best one, or one of the best ones, because there are so many firms in the field. Fire protection is difficult because there are very few firms. It's really just getting started as an industry. Garbage collection and the various kinds of maintenance services. Street maintenance, tree trimming, park maintenance, golf course operation. There are loads and loads and loads of firms in this field. I went to a conference last April that Cal State Hayward organized a conference on private contracting in park and recreation services. And they were just amazed that with very tiny amount of publicity, over 100 people turned up to come to this conference. And they were reporting there were people from park and recreation departments and private service providers getting together. And everybody just amazed each other by how many of the city officials were already either considering or actually doing this private contracting, and how many firms were in the field already in California providing these services. Virtually any landscaping business can very easily get into the business of providing these services, and some of the individual case studies are just amazing at how much money they save. More typically, it's 20 to 30% in that area, but sometimes they save 75% on huge increases in productivity. Yeah.
Are there any state issues that we could?
Well, there's a possibility of it gets complicated because of the relationship between the state government and city governments, and there are charter cities and non-charter cities, and I haven't done a lot of detailed legal research on this, but there's some area for reform of state legislation to allow cities more flexibility, to allow cities, counties, and special districts more flexibility. For example, I did some research about 5 years ago for a local fire district on whether they could stop contracting with the county fire department and instead contract with a private firm for fire protection. And the county council took a look at the existing special district legislation and concluded that it was questionable whether a fire district has the authority under present law in the government code to contract with a private firm, instead of either operating the service itself or hiring the county fire department to do so. So, I mean, there are areas that need researching. Unfortunately, I don't have the answers to them as ready-made campaign issues. But there is a lot there are barriers here and there throughout the system that make it not always legal to do some of the things that I've talked about in every case. And so those barriers need to be removed. And recently, for example, the city and county both the city and the county voters in Los Angeles in November of '78 voted new flexibility for both the city and county government to contract for any service that they could find to be more cost-effective done privately than publicly. This is the kind of thing that would probably be a big help at any level of government. And the state government, there could and should be changes in the government code to allow the state government complete flexibility and freedom to contract with private firms. Also, where the state has control over what cities do, to allow cities to offer tax credits for groups of homeowners that get together and hire private services to replace the need for public services. That would be a beautiful measure right there. I don't know enough to know exactly how it should be worded, but state legislation would certainly facilitate that process. We have probably time for about one more question right here.
I'd be interested in a ranking of cities showing the degree to which City Hall has been cut back. Does there exist such a list or ranking?
There does not. I'm going to be meeting in about 2 weeks with a researcher from the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., who's coming to pick my brains about suggestions for research that needs to be done over the next 5 years by people like the Urban Institute. He's been following the work that I've been doing the last few years and wants to have suggestions. That's one that I will certainly be talking with him about. That research does need to be done, and I hope it will be done over the next few years. One other commercial, if I may. I do a thing called Fiscal Watchdog, which is a monthly newspaper column on the kind of ideas I've talked about today, of ways of cutting the costs of local government, largely by getting the private sector involved and making people pay directly instead of by taxes. It's been going since October 1976, and it's available free of charge to any newspaper in this country that requests it from the local government center in Santa Barbara. The National Taxpayers Union pays us to do it and to make it available, and so far there's about 160 newspapers around the country that carry it. If you would like to get your local paper to carry it, we can give you a little, I don't have them here, but you can just write to me, care of Reason, and we'll send you some literature on the column, and then you can take it to your local newspaper editor and ask them to carry it. It can help prepare a climate of opinion in your community that will be much more favorable to these ideas when your people propose them. So, thank you very much. Pardon? It's called Fiscal Watchdog. I've been told we have to ask the room to be cleared so the next thing can take place, so we should all go.
Yeah, Robert, I'm Jim Lorenz from Pleasure Reading. You've been reading it for years. Yes, I figured you must be. I really agree that we should shift emphasis to the private sector and make them pay the bills as they go.
If you have a card or something, if you'd like information on the Fiscal Watchdog thing, you can just give me that and I'll make a note on it and I'll send it to you. Save you the trouble of writing it for us.